Hello, my name's Tim Shoebridge. On behalf of Cherry Audio, I'm really very delighted, chuffed, as we say in the UK, to be able to give you a run through of their latest product. It is the KR55C. So what is the KR55C? Well, it is Cherry Audio's painstaking recreation of a classic drum machine from all the way back in 1979, the Korg Rhythm 55, or KR55 as it actually was known. There were actually two versions of the KR55. There was the original one that came out in 79, and then there was a KR55B, very imaginatively named by Korg, that came out 3 years later. Apart from the colour scheme, the difference in colour, the only difference between these two models was the amount of memory. There was twice the amount of memory in the 55B, meaning there were twice as many preset patterns in the 55B. But there were 48 basic patterns in the original 55, 96 in the 55B. That's a lot of patterns for a drum machine at that time. Now, both of those models, they were really quite basic. They were not programmable in any way. You just had those presets to play. They had intros and fills, but you could actually have control over the volume of the individual drum sounds. So you could get quite a lot of variation. But as I say, quite bog standard drum machines. However, back in the late 70s, early 80s, they fell into the hands of some musicians and artists who were crying out for electronic percussion to go with their electronic music. One example being Depeche Mode, who used the KR55 quite famously, and Vince Clarke, electronic music making genius that he is, then took that KR55 and used it in subsequent projects with Yazoo and Erasure. There were quite a number of electronic music bands in the early 80s that were using the KR55. Now, it was also famously used by Joe Jackson in his incredibly wonderful song Stepping Out, and I must apologise at this point because I got it mixed up with the Roland CR78. They do sound quite similar, these drum machines, and I featured Stepping Out in the Cherry Audio CR78 video I did ages ago, so I do apologise for that. I'm not going to attempt to recreate that song using the KR55, but I'm going to choose a different artist, and that artist is Jean-Michel Jarre. Now, he used the KR55 quite famously in his album, I think it was 1981, Les Chants Magnétiques, Magnetic Songs. Right, that's enough waffle from me about the history of the KR55. Let's take a look at Cherry Audio's KR55C and take a look at the front panel. Now, you'll see there a lot of controls on the front panel of Cherry Audio's version of the KR55. Let's compare that to an original Korg machine. There are very few knobs on the front panel of an original KR55, very few ways that you can actually alter the sound, but what Korg did provide was a row of knobs, as you'll see there across the top, where you could alter the individual levels of the different drum sounds that there are in a drum kit. Now, there are more drum sounds than there are knobs, so they're kind of grouped by family, but what Korg have done is provide us with 6 knobs to control the volume of things like the kick drum, the snare, cymbals, hi-hat, etc. We have the same capability here with Cherry Audio's version, but maybe this view, the view that you see when you first launch the KR55C, is probably not appropriate. Up here, top right, you'll see that there's an edit mode. There are 3 basic views. We are currently in instrument edit. I'll come on to that in a little while. It's incredibly powerful. Let's go to the mix view, because I think this is as close to the original KR55 as you can get. Here we have that same row of knobs where we can control the volume of the individual sounds. So I will demonstrate that to you. Let me just get a little pattern going. There you go. I can turn things up and down. I've noticed with the Jean-Michel Jarre's use of the KL55, he's doing a lot of muting of individual sounds to create patterns that are, maybe unique to him, but that's the only control he really had in the original drum machine. Here we've got control over the volume, but also Cherry Audio have given us a really convenient row of 2 buttons actually per instrument. We've got solo buttons, and we've got mute buttons. Really handy, rather than having to go around each of the knobs and turn them up and down. And of course, this is the 21st century. We have stereo. 1979, 1980, not a lot of stereo instruments around at that time. The original Korg KR55 was a mono instrument. Here, with Cherry Audio's version, we have stereo, so we can pan. Okay, let's take a look at this section here. This is where all the factory preset rhythms are. I'll just stop it. I'm going to say preset quite a lot, and it's probably out of context. When I talk about the presets, I'm really talking about the original patterns that were in the Korg KR55, which are all these ones here. We've got 16 buttons, selecting 16 different patterns. Preset patterns, factory preset patterns, and then we have 3 variations of each. That's giving us our 48 in total. Very easy to select them. It's just exactly the same as you would with a Roland CR78, for example. You choose your pattern, and then you've got your different variations here. That's variation B, and then variation C. And that was pretty much it. That was your preset on an original Korg KR55. Now with Cherry Audio's KR55C, it's not just the pattern that's playing that's part of your preset, but it's all of the other parameters, all the sound parameters, because you can manipulate these sounds. You can really change them a lot. And then of course you've got effects routings and effects parameters as well. So all of those things together is what is called a Cherry Audio preset, like all of their other virtual instruments. So I apologize if I'm going to use the word preset out of context here. I will try and use the word pattern or rhythm to describe these things here. But as you can see, very, very simple to select them. We have our 16 buttons, 3 variations in total. We've got control over the swing, we've got control over the speed. If I was running this inside my DAW, then I could synchronize it to clock, MIDI clock for example. We've got an overall volume control, and we have this little button here for introducing fills or a little intro at the beginning of the pattern, depending on at what point you press it. All of that stuff is the same as what you get on the original KR55. Right, so just a couple of more things to cover before we move on from this mix edit view. Now, right at the beginning, I did mention, of course, that there were 2 models of the original Korg Rhythm 55. There was the KR55, KR55B, and we have both of those emulations inside Cherry Audio's virtual instrument. With just a flick of a switch down here, we can switch between those 2 different models. So we can flick down to the 55B. It changes the color scheme, of course, so that there's no confusion of which one you're accessing. Now, how do you access that double memory, all those other second set of 48 preset patterns? Well, we have a pattern group here, so let me just give you an example. Let's choose the rumba. So this is pattern group 1, and if I flip the switch down, we'll get pattern group 2. So 16 preset rhythms, 3 variations of each, times 2 when you go with the 55B model emulation. Only other thing just to mention, but we'll come on to it in the next section, are all of these little buttons here across the top. We have individual effects ends to the individual voices, the individual instruments. We'll cover the effects next. Right, let's take a brief look at the effects section. Let's go and change our edit mode to effects, and you'll see here that we have a completely different top panel to the instrument. We have got an overdrive section with two different flavors of overdrive emulation. We have some modulation effects, that's flanger and chorus. We have three different types of delay. We have a digital delay, a tape echo, and a ping pong delay. And then we have three different reverb emulations. We've got room, plate, and galactic reverb. At the top, we have got a bus compressor and a limiter here. Best thing to do is to just play a pattern and play around with some of these controls and give you a feel for what they do. So let's play this Rock 8. There we go. Let's switch this compressor on. I'm going to play around with these and create some quite sort of like drastic changes to the sound. As you can hear there. This control here is applying a high pass filter to the audio input. Not that we hear it, but it's before the compressor detects how and when to do its compression. And what this can do is it can affect the bass sounds, because you can have some quite sort of like strong heavy bass sounds in your drums. So this is what's going to control that. So this is at one extreme. Oh, that's the other extreme. You can hear that the bass really drops off at that extreme. So that's our compressor. We have a limiter as well, just to make sure that we don't blow up our speakers. Let's play around with some of these effects. But in order to hear these effects, we have to send our drum sounds to them. So we go back to the mix section, and let's do that. Maybe not that. Right, so that was a brief look at the effects, but let's get on to the meat and potatoes of Cherry Audio's KR55C, and that is all of the instrument edit settings. Now obviously the original KR55 from Korg is an all analog drum machine, and what we have here with Cherry Audio's recreation of it is a virtual analog emulation. It's not samples, it is analog circuitry emulated in software, DSP programming, to create those original sounds, which means that we have got the ability to manipulate those sounds which we wouldn't be able to with samples. So let's switch to the instrument edit screen, which is the very first sort of view you get when you launch KR55C for the first time, and you'll see that we have a whole load of knobs for every single sound. Now I'm going to play these sounds using my MIDI keyboard. It's laid out like general MIDI would require you to, with the kick on the C, snare on the D, etc. We've got open and closed hi-hats on F sharp and G sharp. And that brings me on to something I do want to mention. Although we have these 11 different sounds, this hi-hat sound is used for both open and closed hi-hat, but you'll hear that they are different. That's open and that's closed. They have a different length to them, and they're in a choke group. So if I was to open up the decay a lot on the open hi-hat like this, but then interrupt it with the closed hi-hat, we get the desired effect as you'd expect from a drum machine. So these parameters here are affecting both open and closed. So we've already discovered the sort of the decay control here. We have a tune control. We've got control over the transient, so we've got the ability to give it a really hard attack. Or much softer. And we have an EQ per instrument, and we have an EQ frequency and an EQ amount, sorry, which can be positive or negative. So it's a lot more flexible than just a simple tone control. So let's go fully positive. Or say fully negative. So that's just the hi-hat. Let's play around with, say, the snare drum. I'm not going to go through all of the different instruments that we've got here, but as you can hear, there's an awful lot of control over the tones of each of those instruments. And when we talk about Cherry Audio presets for the KR55C, it's all of those tone control settings, plus the patterns themselves, plus the effects that make up a preset. And there are loads of them. I can't remember how many there are, but there are loads and loads and loads of them. They've gone through as well and painstakingly recreated every single factory preset, not just the sort of the main rhythms, but the intros and the fills as well, making sure that all of the sound parameters match as closely as possible to the original KR55. There's tons and tons of stuff in here, lots of old vintage stuff and loads of modern sounds as well. So before we move off of this instrument edit screen, I mentioned just a little while ago that there is a MIDI note number assigned to each of the sounds, and by default they sort of like conform to the sort of general MIDI standard of which notes. There are these little triangles here, these little controls here against each of the instruments, and when you click on them you can actually set which MIDI note each of those sounds is assigned to, either choosing it from a list or playing it on your MIDI keyboard and learning it. So you can do that for all of the sounds here. When it comes to the hi-hats, as you'll see from the little menu, we have got that ability for the closed hi-hat and for the open hi-hat. So that's where you can set the note numbers if you want to change them. And of course it goes without saying that all of these controls are MIDI learnable. They're automatable over MIDI. You just right click on them and then you've got MIDI learn there, where you just fiddle with the control on your MIDI controller and it'll attach itself to that particular control on the instrument, and you've got that on all of the different pages across all of Cherry Audio's instruments, which is really, really great. So One last section I want to show you here, and that is how to edit patterns. So we have all of these factory patterns here, 48 or 96 depending on which model emulation you're running, but you can edit those and you can create your own from scratch, and you do that up here top right with this user pattern mode. When we click on that, then we see some parts of the screen I've changed. We've now got a sort of a programmer section over here, and these buttons down here have now turned into steps in a sequence, 16 steps at a time, up to 32 steps that you can program in. Now, to edit your own patterns, it's so straightforward. If you've used any kind of step sequencer before, then you'll be right at home here. We have a rotary encoder where you can select the sound that you want to program. So let's go with snare to start off with. And then it's just a question of just putting in the steps that you want to hear that snare on. Let's just play. So we've got the snare going on. Let's go to the bass drum. Hi-hat. It's that simple. It's so simple. Once you've created your pattern, you've got a song mode here where you can chain patterns together to create longer of sort of evolving or repeating sequences. There's so much you can do here in terms of this very simple way of editing your patterns, and then when you save your presets, you are saving your patterns and your sound parameters together. So that's all I've got time for in this video. What I'm going to say next, I think you can anticipate it, but I mean it 100% sincerely, and that is my time with the KR55C from Cherry Audio has been a whole load of fun. It really has. It's a perfect excuse to go down memory lane and get all nostalgic about sounds of the late 70s and the early 80s, but as well it is a fantastic tool for discovering new sounds and new ways to get creative. I honestly do recommend that you check it out, and also please check out the user guide as well. It's packed with really useful information. That's all for me. Thanks very much. Until the next time.